The Blue and Brown Books by Ludwig Wittgenstein quotes. The Blue and Brown Books by Ludwig Wittgenstein serves as an essential prelude to his later masterpiece, Philosophical Investigations, providing foundational insights into his evolving thoughts on language, meaning, and the nature of philosophical problems. Compiled from Wittgenstein's Cambridge lectures in the 1930s, this work introduces the concept of language games and emphasizes the role of language in shaping our understanding of reality. Wittgenstein critiques the traditional view of language as a fixed system of representation, proposing instead that language gains meaning through its use in various forms of life. By exploring the intricate relationship between words, thoughts, and context, the Blue and Brown Books challenges readers to reconsider fundamental assumptions about knowledge and meaning, foreshadowing Wittgenstein's later philosophical shifts. Quote 1. What is length? Or, what is meaning? Or, what is the number one? Etc. produce in us a mental cramp. We feel that we can't point to anything in reply to them, and yet ought to point to something. This quote introduces Wittgenstein's idea that certain philosophical questions create a sense of confusion, or mental cramp, because we instinctively search for concrete objects to correspond to abstract concepts like meaning or number. These types of questions expose a misunderstanding of language, where we expect every noun to have a corresponding physical thing, leading to philosophical confusion. Quote 2. What one generally calls explanations of the meaning of a word can, very roughly, be divided into verbal and ostensive definitions. Wittgenstein discusses two primary ways people define words: verbally, through language, and ostensively, by pointing to objects. He points out that while verbal definitions seem to go in circles by referring to other words, ostensive definitions appear more direct. But even these can lead to misunderstandings. His distinction suggests that the complexity of language lies in how definitions depend on context and understanding. Quote 3. If the meaning of the sign, roughly that which is of importance about the sign, is an image built up in our minds when we see or hear the sign, then first let us adopt the method we just described of replacing this mental image by some outward object seen, e.g., a painted or modeled image. Here, Wittgenstein questions the idea that understanding language involves creating mental images. He suggests an experiment where mental images are replaced by physical ones, like a painted picture, and asks whether this substitution would make the words more meaningful. This highlights his view that meaning is not something internal or hidden, but is instead tied to the use of language in a shared system. Quote 4. The sign, the sentence, gets its significance from the system of signs, from the language to which it belongs. Roughly, understanding a sentence means understanding a language. Wittgenstein emphasizes that the meaning of a sentence comes not from isolated words or images, but from its place within the broader system of language. To understand a sentence is to understand the rules and structure of the language itself, suggesting that meaning is inherently social and practical, rather than something internal or private. Quote 5. If we are taught the meaning of the word yellow by being given some sort of ostensive definition, a rule of the usage of the word, this teaching can be looked at in two different ways. Wittgenstein explores the idea of learning language through ostensive definitions, noting that this teaching process can either be seen as a kind of training that creates associations or as learning a rule. He argues that understanding and using a word is more complex than simply forming associations. It involves knowing how to apply rules in specific contexts, revealing the deeper mechanics of language learning. Quote 6. Now, what makes it difficult for us to take this line of investigation is our craving for generality. Wittgenstein points out that our tendency to look for universal definitions or commonalities across diverse instances often complicates philosophical investigation. This craving for generality leads us to overlook the particularities of specific cases, which could provide clearer insights into the concepts we're exploring. By focusing on general explanations, we miss out on the nuances that make each case unique, resulting in confusion. Quote 7. The idea that in order to get clear about the meaning of a general term, one had to find the common element in all its applications has shackled philosophical investigation. Wittgenstein critiques the assumption that philosophical clarity comes from finding a common feature across all uses of a general term. He argues that this method has been unproductive and has led philosophers to dismiss the concrete cases that could have provided valuable understanding. This approach creates unnecessary complexity by making philosophy chase after abstractions rather than focusing on the way language is actually used in everyday life. Quote 8. It is misleading, then, to talk of thinking as of a mental activity. We may say that thinking is essentially the activity of operating with signs. Wittgenstein challenges the traditional view of thinking as an internal mental activity, suggesting instead that thinking should be seen as working with signs, whether through speech, writing, or imagination. He emphasizes that thinking occurs through these external operations, rather than in an isolated mental realm. This shifts the focus from an introspective view of thought to one that is grounded in the use of language and symbols in practical contexts. Quote 9. Philosophy really is purely descriptive. Wittgenstein asserts that philosophy should aim to describe how language is actually used, rather than trying to explain or reduce phenomena to simple principles as science does. He stresses that the philosopher's task is to clarify the grammar of our expressions and resolve confusion that arises from the misuse of language, rather than provide grand theories or solutions. This description-based approach emphasizes the importance of understanding language in its practical, everyday functions. Quote 10. Philosophy, as we use the word, is a fight against the fascination which forms of expression exert upon us. Wittgenstein believes that much of philosophical puzzlement arises from being misled by the forms of language. He views philosophy as a struggle to resist the seductive pull of certain linguistic expressions, which often lead us into conceptual confusion. The task of philosophy is to disentangle these confusions by carefully examining the way we use words and the assumptions we make about language. Quote 11. The question is then answered by a wrong definition. Say, time is the motion of the celestial bodies. The next step is to see that this definition is unsatisfactory. Wittgenstein uses this example to show how philosophical confusion often arises from attempts to define complex concepts like time, with oversimplified or inappropriate definitions. When these definitions fail to capture the full meaning of the term, philosophers feel compelled to search for another, more correct one. This process reflects a misunderstanding of how language works, as words do not always have fixed, precise definitions that apply to every possible context. Quote 12. We want to say here that it can never be our job to reduce anything to anything, or to explain anything. Wittgenstein argues against the reductionist tendency in philosophy, where the goal is to simplify complex phenomena into basic elements or explanations. Instead, he believes that philosophy should focus on understanding and describing the use of language in all its complexity, rather than trying to force phenomena into narrow categories or definitions. This rejection of explanation highlights his commitment to a more descriptive, practice-based approach to philosophical problems. Quote 13. How can one think what is not the case? If I think that King's College is on fire, when it is not on fire, the fact of its being on fire does not exist. Then how can I think it? Wittgenstein highlights the confusion that arises when we try to conceptualize thinking about something that does not correspond to reality. He shows that language can mislead us by making us think we need to point to a tangible fact to validate a thought. The example shows how the very act of thinking does not require the fact itself to exist, but rather relies on linguistic structures to enable us to think about things, even those that are not real. Quote 14. What makes a portrait the portrait of so-and-so? The answer, which might first suggest itself, is the similarity between the portrait and Mr. N. this answer in fact shows what we had in mind when we talked of the shadow of a fact. Wittgenstein explores the concept of representation, questioning how something like a portrait relates to the person it depicts. He critiques the idea that simple similarity between a portrait and a person explains this relationship. Instead, he suggests that it is the intention behind the creation of the portrait, not mere resemblance, that defines its connection to the person, thus dismissing a superficial understanding of representation. Quote 15. We are tempted to think that while my friend said, "Mr. N will come to see me," and meant what he said, his mind must have made the connection. Here, Wittgenstein critiques the notion that meaning involves a special mental process. He argues that meaning is not a mysterious mental act, but is instead embedded in the way we use language and point to things. The temptation to imagine that meaning happens in the mind is based on a misunderstanding of language and its ordinary use. Quote 16. Let us sum up. If we scrutinize the usages which we make of such words as thinking, meaning, wishing, etc., going through this process rids us of the temptation to look for a peculiar act of thinking, independent of the act of expressing a thought. Wittgenstein suggests that a careful examination of how we use words like thinking and meaning helps dissolve the philosophical temptation to search for a mysterious, independent mental process. He emphasizes that thinking, meaning, and similar activities are not hidden mental acts, but are expressed in language. By focusing on the grammar and use of these words, we avoid the trap of assuming an internal mechanism behind them. Quote 17. The difficulty in philosophy is to say, "no more than we know." This quote encapsulates Wittgenstein's view that philosophical clarity comes from restraint, avoiding speculative theories that go beyond what can be clearly articulated. He warns that much of the confusion in philosophy arises from overreaching beyond what we actually know or can describe, advocating instead for a method that sticks to the facts presented by language and experience. Quote 18. We are tempted to think that in order to clear up such matters philosophically, our ordinary language is too coarse, that we need a more subtle one. Wittgenstein addresses the common philosophical belief that ordinary language is inadequate for solving deep problems, suggesting that this view is mistaken. He argues that while ordinary language might seem imprecise, it is precisely what we need for philosophical clarity. This misperception arises from misunderstanding how language functions, not from its inherent limitations. Quote 19. The phrase, "to express an idea which is before our mind," suggests that what we are trying to express in words is already expressed, only in a different language. Wittgenstein critiques the metaphor of having an idea before our mind, as if it exists fully formed and simply needs translation into words. He argues that this metaphor is misleading, as expressing ideas is not about translating from a pre-existing mental language, but is instead an active process of finding the right words. This highlights how our metaphors for thinking can create philosophical confusion. Quote 20. There is a temptation for me to say that only my own experience is real. I know that I see, hear, feel pains, etc., but not that anyone else does. Wittgenstein addresses the solipsistic temptation to believe that only one's own experiences are real. This thought arises from the seeming impossibility of directly accessing another's pain or sensory experiences. He acknowledges the discomfort this idea creates, yet also shows how it leads to a philosophical puzzle, as it contradicts common sense, where we naturally assume that others have experiences like ours, despite not directly accessing them. Quote 21. At first sight it may appear, but why it should can only become clear later, that here we have two kinds of worlds built of different materials, a mental world and a physical world. Wittgenstein explores the idea that there seem to be two distinct realms, mental and physical, because we experience them differently. However, he cautions that this distinction is misleading. The idea of mind and matter being made of different materials stems from a confusion in the way we talk about mental and physical phenomena. This sets up his argument that such dualism is a product of language rather than a reflection of reality. Quote 22. The trouble is, rather, that the sentence, "A machine thinks, perceives, wishes," seems somehow nonsensical. Here, Wittgenstein challenges the idea that machines could think or have mental experiences. He suggests that the problem is not technological, but linguistic. The concept of a machine thinking feels nonsensical because of the way we use the words think and machine. The sentence does not make sense within our ordinary language because thinking is tied to human experiences, not to mechanical processes. Quote 23. When we look at everything that we know and can say about the world as resting upon personal experience, then what we know seems to lose a good deal of its value, reliability, and solidity. Wittgenstein reflects on the consequences of viewing all knowledge as dependent on personal experience. This perspective makes knowledge appear subjective and unstable, leading us to question its validity. He argues that this is another instance where language misleads us, as it creates the illusion that our experiences lack solidity simply because they are subjective. Quote 24. Now the answer of the common-sense philosopher is that surely there is no difficulty in the idea of supposing, thinking, imagining that someone else has what I have. Wittgenstein highlights the response of common-sense philosophy to solipsism. The common-sense view assumes that imagining someone else having experiences like our own is not a problem. However, Wittgenstein points out that this answer oversimplifies the issue and fails to address the underlying linguistic and conceptual difficulties that give rise to solipsism in the first place. Quote 25. If we make an image of the other person's pain, do we apply it in the same way in which we apply the image, say, of a black eye, when we imagine the other person having one? In this quote, Wittgenstein explores how imagining another person's pain is different from imagining something like a black eye. The image of pain cannot be verified or compared in the same way that a visual image can. This highlights the complexity of talking about personal experiences like pain, which do not lend themselves to the same kinds of comparisons or representations as physical objects. Quote 26. We make a picture like that, of the two colors being in each other's way, or that of a barrier which doesn't allow one person to come closer to another's experience than to the point of observing his behavior. But on looking closer, we find that we can't apply the picture which we have made. Wittgenstein critiques the mental image we create when we think about the barrier between personal experiences. He points out that while it feels like there's a barrier preventing us from accessing someone else's experience directly, this picture is not applicable upon closer inspection. It reflects a misunderstanding of the way language and experience work, rather than an actual physical barrier. Quote 27. The difficulty which we express by saying, "I can't know what he sees," when he, truthfully, says that he sees a blue patch, arises from the idea that knowing what he sees means seeing that which he also sees. Wittgenstein addresses the confusion that arises when we assume that knowing what someone else sees involves seeing exactly the same object as they do, as though their experience of seeing is internal and inaccessible to us. He points out that this assumption leads to an unnecessary puzzle. The grammatical difference between "I don't know what he sees" and "I don't know what he looks at" reveals the misunderstanding, as these expressions imply different uses and expectations in language rather than a deep philosophical problem. Quote 28. When I think about it a little longer, I see that what I wished to say was, always when anything is seen, something is seen. Wittgenstein reflects on the solipsistic statement, always when anything is seen, it is always I who see it. He concludes that this statement mistakenly focuses on the I, when what is really intended is a tautology, that when anything is seen, something is indeed seen. The issue lies in how we confuse a general fact about seeing with the illusion of a special, personal perspective. By analyzing the language, Wittgenstein demonstrates that the solipsistic claim does not convey anything more than a basic observation about perception itself. Quote 29. There are two different cases in the use of the word I, or my, which I might call the use as object and the use as subject. Wittgenstein distinguishes between two ways in which we use the word I. When I is used as an object, it refers to a physical body or characteristics, e.g., my arm is broken. When used as a subject, it refers to inner experiences like thoughts, sensations, or perceptions, e.g., I have a toothache. He emphasizes that in cases where I is used as a subject, there is no possibility of error because it is not about recognizing or identifying a physical object, but about expressing an immediate personal experience. Quote 30. The kernel of our proposition that that which has pains or sees or thinks is of a mental nature is only that the word I in I have pains does not denote a particular body, for we can't substitute for I a description of a body. Wittgenstein explores the philosophical notion that the I must be of a mental nature because it refers to experiences like pain or thought. He argues that this idea stems from a misunderstanding of the word I. Unlike references to physical objects, we cannot replace I with a bodily description because I, in such contexts, does not denote a body at all. The word I functions differently when describing mental activities, and this difference in grammar is key to avoiding confusion about the nature of the self. Quote 31. We are inclined to forget that it is the particular use of a word only which gives the word its meaning. Wittgenstein warns against the temptation to think that words carry inherent meanings apart from their use in language. He emphasizes that meaning arises from the practical application of words in specific contexts. Without this use, words like I or toothache lose their meaning. This insight is crucial for understanding how language functions and for avoiding philosophical errors that arise from abstracting words from their everyday use. Quote 32. We feel then that in the cases in which I is used as subject, we don't use it because we recognize a particular person by his bodily characteristics, and this creates the illusion that we use this word to refer to something bodiless. Wittgenstein addresses the philosophical illusion that when we use I as a subject, it refers to a non-physical, bodiless entity. This illusion arises because in such cases, I is not tied to physical recognition, but to mental experiences. He explains that this way of using I leads to the false belief that the self must be something separate from the body, reinforcing metaphysical views about the mind-body split. Quote 33. Now, the danger we are in when we adopt the sense-datum notation is to forget the difference between the grammar of a statement about sense data and the grammar of an outwardly similar statement about physical objects. Wittgenstein warns of the risk involved in using the concept of sense data without recognizing that its grammar differs fundamentally from statements about physical objects. By treating sense data as though they are comparable to physical objects, we are misled into thinking we are talking about the same kind of thing. This confusion can create philosophical puzzles where none need exist, as we mix different kinds of language use. Quote 34. Augustine, in describing his learning of language, says that he was taught to speak by learning the names of things. It is clear that whoever says this has in mind the way in which a child learns such words as man, sugar, table, etc. He does not primarily think of such words as today, not, but, perhaps. Wittgenstein uses this quote to challenge Augustine's simplified account of language learning, which focuses on nouns like man and table. He points out that this view overlooks more abstract or relational words such as not and but, which are just as fundamental to language. This sets the stage for Wittgenstein's broader argument that language involves far more than merely naming objects. It includes a wide array of functions and uses. Quote 35. We think of the meaning of signs sometimes as states of mind of the man using them, sometimes as the role which these signs are playing in a system of language. Wittgenstein highlights the dual nature of how we understand meaning. On one hand, we may think of meaning as a mental experience tied to the speaker. On the other hand, meaning can also be seen in terms of the function a word or sign plays within a language system. He shows that while we are tempted to link meaning to mental states, the real work of language is done in its usage within a shared system of communication. Quote 36. What particularly tempts us to this view is that a man, on being asked whether he pointed to the color or the shape, is, at least in most cases, able to answer this and to be certain that his answer is correct. Wittgenstein observes how we are drawn to the idea that pointing to something, like the color or shape of an object, involves a clear mental act of meaning, either the color or the shape. Yet, when we look closely, no specific mental act always accompanies such gestures. This emphasizes that meaning is not necessarily tied to a conscious state, but rather emerges from the broader context in which the language is used. Quote 37. Systems of communication, as for instance 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we shall call language games. They are more or less akin to what in ordinary language we call games. Here, Wittgenstein introduces the concept of language games, which are simple systems of communication that reflect the various ways language can function. By calling them games, he highlights the idea that language operates according to rules, much like a game does. This analogy helps to show that meaning in language is not fixed, but dependent on the specific rules and context of each game. Quote 38. We find that what connects all the cases of comparing is a vast number of overlapping similarities. And as soon as we see this, we feel no longer compelled to say that there must be some one feature common to them all. Wittgenstein discusses how we often assume that all cases of comparing must share a single defining characteristic. However, upon closer examination, we realize that these cases are linked by a network of overlapping similarities rather than a single common feature. This insight reveals his view that many concepts in language are not defined by strict boundaries, but by family resemblances among their various uses. Quote 39. Mental images of colors, shapes, sounds, etc., which play a role in communication by means of language, we put in the same category with patches of color actually seen, sounds heard. Wittgenstein draws a comparison between mental images and actual sensory experiences, suggesting that in the context of communication, both play similar roles. He argues that whether we are referring to a mental image or something physically seen, both can function as parts of a language game, challenging the idea that mental and physical experiences are fundamentally different in their role within language. Quote 40. The pupil could also be trained to give things names of his own invention and to bring the objects when the names are called. Wittgenstein introduces the idea that a pupil can be trained to invent his own names for objects, demonstrating the flexibility and creativity within language learning. This highlights that the structure and use of language are not fixed, but can be shaped by the individual, provided they follow certain rules. The process of naming is not about inherent meaning, but about agreed-upon conventions that enable communication, showing how language is a system of signs rather than a reflection of internal mental states. Quote 41. Tables, ostensive definitions, and similar instruments I shall call rules, in accordance with ordinary usage. The use of a rule can be explained by a further rule. This quote explores Wittgenstein's view that language rules are recursive and can themselves be defined or explained by other rules. It reveals the layered structure of language and communication, where the application of one rule often necessitates the use of another to fully explain its use. This endless possibility of further explanation illustrates the complexity of how language functions and how meanings are generated within structured systems. Quote 42. The difference between the finite and infinite game does not seem to lie in the material tools of the game, for we should be inclined to say that infinity can't be expressed in them. That is, that we can only conceive of it in our thoughts, and hence that it is in these thoughts that the finite and infinite game must be distinguished. Wittgenstein contrasts finite and infinite games, pointing out that the key distinction is not in the physical elements used, but in the way we think about the game. He suggests that infinity is a conceptual notion that cannot be fully captured through tangible means, highlighting how certain ideas, such as the infinite, exist primarily in the realm of thought rather than physical reality. Quote 43. We find that there must be a big and essential difference somewhere, but if you look closely at what happens when the hands are played, you find that you can only detect a number of differences in details, each of which would seem inessential. Wittgenstein discusses the way we often assume there is a fundamental difference between two systems or activities. Yet when examined closely, the differences are often subtle or related to minor details. This observation reflects his view that the search for essential differences can be misguided, as language and actions are often distinguished by a complex array of overlapping similarities rather than sharp distinctions. Quote 44. What particularly tempts us to this distinction is the linear writing of the part outside the table. Though from certain points of view we should call the linear character of the sentence merely external and inessential, this character and similar ones play a great role in what as logicians we are inclined to say about sentences and propositions. Here, Wittgenstein reflects on how certain formal aspects of language, such as the linear arrangement of sentences, can influence our understanding of meaning and logic. While these aspects may seem superficial, they significantly shape how logicians and philosophers conceptualize language and its structure, suggesting that even seemingly external features can have deep implications for how language is understood and analyzed. Quote 45. Let us see what role the words can or to be able to play in our language. Wittgenstein examines how words like can or to be able to function in language, showing that their use often reflects more than just a description of ability. These expressions can carry meanings related to potential actions, states, or conditions, depending on the context. His analysis highlights the fluidity and context dependence of seemingly straightforward terms, suggesting that their meaning is shaped by the way they are used in particular situations. Quote 46. This answer is not given in the same words in which, under the circumstances characterizing narration, he would say that he has swum across this river, but it is given in the terms of the question asked by the chief. Wittgenstein explains that in certain contexts, the same fact, such as someone swimming across a river, is communicated differently depending on the situation. When the fact is narrated, it is expressed in one way, while in the context of a question or command, it is framed differently. This demonstrates that the meaning of statements is not fixed, but changes based on the role they play within a particular language game, emphasizing the importance of context in communication. Quote 47. What characterizes an order as such, or a description as such, is the role which the utterance of these signs plays in the whole practice of the language. Wittgenstein points out that whether a statement functions as an order, a description, or something else depends on how it is used within the broader context of a language. The meaning of any particular utterance is not inherent, but is determined by the function it serves in specific communicative practices. This highlights his view that language is a tool for various purposes, and its meaning is shaped by use. Quote 48. This misunderstanding consists in regarding the outward means the teacher uses to induce the child to go on as what we might call an indirect means of making himself understood to the child. Wittgenstein describes a common misunderstanding in language learning where we might assume that a teacher's gestures or prompts are simply indirect ways to convey meaning to a child. In reality, these outward signs are part of the process through which meaning is created. Language learning is not about guessing at pre-existing meanings, but about responding to and participating in a shared practice. Quote 49. We talk about the flow of events, but also about the flow of time, the river on which the logs travel. Here, Wittgenstein explores how we use metaphors like the flow of time to describe abstract concepts. He suggests that language sometimes traps us in misleading analogies, as when we think of time as if it were a physical substance, like a river flowing past us. This metaphorical way of speaking can create philosophical confusion, making us think that time behaves in ways it does not. Quote 50. The function of the word now is entirely different from that of a specification of time. Wittgenstein clarifies that the word now does not function in the same way as other temporal markers like 6 o'clock. While both may seem to refer to points in time, now serves a different purpose in our language games. Its meaning arises from its immediate and context-dependent use, contrasting with the more fixed and specific references provided by clock times. Quote 51. We say, surely there must be something else behind the mere uttering of the formula, as this alone we should not call being able to. Wittgenstein addresses the temptation to believe that being able to go on with a sequence, such as in a mathematical problem, must involve some hidden mental process beyond simply uttering a formula. He argues that this is a misleading metaphor. There is no mysterious something else behind the action. The ability to go on is reflected in the actual practice, not in some unseen mental activity behind it. Quote 52. We can say, the expression B can continue the series is used under different circumstances to make different distinctions. Wittgenstein highlights that the phrase B can continue the series serves various functions in different contexts, depending on what distinctions we need to make. For example, it could mean that B remembers the formula, hasn't forgotten the numerals, or is in the right state of mind to continue. The flexibility in the use of such expressions emphasizes how meaning is shaped by the particular context in which a phrase is used, rather than by a fixed definition. Quote 53. We are justified in saying that the sentence, he can continue the series, has a different meaning from this. He knows the formula. Wittgenstein asserts that although he can continue the series might sometimes seem synonymous with he knows the formula, the two expressions can carry different meanings in different situations. This distinction points to the nuanced way language operates, where similar phrases may imply different things depending on their context, showing that meaning in language is not always directly tied to knowledge or facts. Quote 54. Now, looking back to our discussion we see that it was no real explanation of B's being guided by the signs when we said that B was guided if he could also have carried out orders consisting in other combinations of dots and dashes than those of. Wittgenstein reflects on how saying B is guided by the signs in language games like 43 does not provide a full explanation. The expression of being guided is not merely about following specific rules, but about understanding how actions are connected to signs in various contexts. This reinforces the idea that meaning in language emerges from its use in practice, rather than from abstract explanations. Quote 55. The use of the word reading is, of course, extremely familiar to us in the circumstances of our ordinary life. Wittgenstein emphasizes how deeply ingrained the concept of reading is in our daily lives, yet its meaning can vary depending on the situation. Whether someone reads a word letter by letter, guesses from context, or acts like a machine, the word reading applies differently. This shows that even familiar terms have flexible and context-dependent meanings, highlighting the complexity of language. Quote 56. But does this mean that the word deriving, or understanding, has really no meaning? As by following up its meaning, this seems to trail off into nothing? Wittgenstein questions whether the word deriving or understanding loses its meaning when we try to pin down its essence. He suggests that these words don't have a single underlying definition, but instead gain their meaning through specific examples and uses. This reflects his view that philosophical problems often arise from trying to reduce language to rigid definitions when its actual use is fluid and multifaceted. Quote 57. Our method is purely descriptive. The descriptions we give are not hints of explanations. Wittgenstein clarifies that his approach is descriptive rather than explanatory. His aim is not to provide hidden or deep explanations behind language, but to describe how words and expressions function in ordinary use. This underscores his belief that the role of philosophy is not to solve metaphysical puzzles, but to clear up confusions by closely examining the way language operates in everyday life. The Blue and Brown Books by Ludwig Wittgenstein concludes with a profound reconsideration of how language operates within our lives, positioning language not as a mere conduit for conveying truths, but as an active participant in constructing our worldviews. Wittgenstein illustrates that philosophical issues often stem from misunderstandings embedded within language itself, and he proposes that examining these language games can dissolve confusion rather than offering definitive answers. His work underscores the fluidity of meaning, highlighting that understanding depends not on abstract definitions, but on practical, everyday language use. Wittgenstein's insights leave readers with a transformative vision of philosophy, one that prioritizes clarity and the acknowledgement of language's embeddedness in human experience.
Curious to dive into the mind of Ludwig Wittgenstein? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of the Blue and Brown Books in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.